Welcome to a conversation with New York Times bestselling author Michael Perry, the author of several Wisconsin Historical Society Press books as well, including From the Top, Danger Man Working, and Roughneck Grace. Those are just some of the many, many books that he's written, including other top sellers with other publishers, Visiting Tom, Truck, Population 485, many more, who I'm sure he'll talk about a little bit. I guess one of the questions that I have just to kick things off is, I know you didn't start writing the day that you became a New York Times bestselling author. There was a lot of work that went into getting there. How did the experience of your book doing so well change the way you write? Did it? Did it change you as a writer?
All right, so we'll do a little behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Because you used the phrase, how did your book doing so well change things for you? So just between you and me and whoever else is listening, the book that landed on the New York Times bestseller book is not my best-selling book. I've had other books that have sold far more copies. So when you ask how did it change, it didn't change at all. I just keep hustling because I learned, I knew it going in, but I learned going through the experience that, first of all, what a blessing. If your book can hit the Times list, I still remember opening the email that told me that. I was somewhere in Iowa at 1:30 in the morning out on book tour for that book. And I realized I hadn't checked my email for hours. I've been out driving. And so at 1:30 in the morning, I pulled off the interstate and pulled off to the shoulder of an on-ramp and opened up my email on my phone and got the news. And it was the thrill of a lifetime. Every author hopes for that. So in no way am I diminishing it. And also, again, I'll just be frank about stuff here. It's great to have every subsequent book you ever publish say across the top, New York Times best-selling author, because it's true and it's exciting and I'm very grateful. But having said that, yeah, it's an algorithm and it has to do with timing. It has to do with how many books sell fast and early as opposed to over time. And so it changed my bio, but it didn't really change my life. And I don't mean that negatively. Every day, I got up today and I was writing, and I've had to hustle because the pandemic has taken me off the road. And I have a sort of a hybrid situation where I combine a lot of different things: writing books, essays, newspaper columns, performing music, performing humor, speaking as an author. And so being pulled off the road has really forced me to dig down deep and do a lot of extra writing, more writing, present that writing in many different ways. But the New York Times thing, I think the thing that's nice, again, this is the interview where I guess I'm just going to tell it like it is. The New York Times thing is, I learned a long time ago that I was never going to be one of the cool kids when it comes to the literary world. Now, the literary world has been very good to me. I can recount experiences where I've been privileged to attend events where I'm surrounded with the folks you see who get 3 reviews in the New York Times. But so what the New York Times bestseller list did for me is it's a little calling card. And there are times, if I'm being talked to like I'm from the country, where when the person eventually gets around to figuring out what kind of writing I've done, and they say, what kind of books have you done? And you mention one, and they find out that it was on the New York Times list, suddenly they talk to you differently. I just find that interesting. But mainly, here's the bottom line. If I get up from this room above my garage on our farm in rural Wisconsin, and I drive out to 10 minutes to the feed mill or the post office, or if I drive up north to see my brother, being on the New York Times bestseller list really doesn't do much for me. And so I've gone on, and I've probably put my feet in my mouth both at the same time. But the point is, it was the thrill of a lifetime. It's a privilege and an honor. I'm deeply grateful for it. I can't believe it happened to me, but it also just meant, okay, that was neat. Back to work.
Keep writing. So how do you keep
Keep
writing?
writing.
Yeah, I mean, you got to come up with something every day. Where does that come from? How do you keep motivated to keep writing?
You know, it's a mix of pragmatism and joy. The pragmatism part is that I decided a long time ago that I was going to do my best to make a living at this. And then somewhere along the line, I picked up a family and children and college tuition and health insurance. And so that's the pragmatic part. That's where when I got up this morning, I checked the calendar and I say, okay, I've got 4 things that I have to do today. I have a writing deadline that it doesn't matter if I'm in the mood or if I'm inspired, it has to be met. And so you crank it out. I don't mind using that phrase. You crank it out. And hopefully you've been doing it long enough that even though you're cranking it out, you're paying attention to it artistically, rhythmically, you're listening to it, you're giving your very best, but you're giving your best under strained conditions. Write a weekly newspaper column. It has to be turned in. The day the proofs will show up. It doesn't matter if I look at it and go, oh, I need another 4 days to make this perfect. That's not an option. So that's the pragmatic part. The part that's joy, and joy is an odd word for me because I'm pretty stoic. My joy is mostly expressed quietly through the poetics of writing and the beauty of words. But the joy for me is that when I got up this morning, it has been a tough stretch. Welcome to the club, right? It's been super tough and way more tough for a lot of people. So I'm not whining. I'm just saying it's been a stretch. But when I got up this morning, the first thing I wanted to do was go to the desk right over there out of frame and write. And that's what I got to do. It's what I had to do, but it's also what I got to do, as we say where I'm from. So it's a mix of pragmatism and then just that I have never grown tired of pursuing writing. Man, that makes me pretty lucky.
Yeah, do what you love for a living. My dad used to say that. Then you're never tired of what you're doing for a living. So that's great. And you talked about your different writing styles. Um, the old telling a story in different ways, be it short for a column or long for a book. Can you talk to people about how you as a writer approach those different styles? If you have an idea for writing, you go, "Ooh, that would make a great column," or "Oh, maybe that would be a better book." How do you figure that out?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, I'm grateful that I've wound up in a place where I have to switch up my styles. Honestly, this morning I helped someone write a corporate letter, a very formal corporate letter filled with subtext. And now, did that make me feel like I was back at the poetry slam? No, of course not. But it forced me to dig deep in the toolbox and to apply the tools that I do have from a little different angle. And I used to write radio ads many years ago. I wrote 30-second radio commercials, and that taught me so much about merciless self-editing. Again, had nothing to do with your ego. It just was that you had 29.5 seconds to get your message across. And so if it was 32 seconds, didn't matter how much you loved those 2.5 seconds, they had to go. So I think that kind of, again, we're back to the pragmatic and practical part of writing. Those experiences are kind of like calisthenics. They taught me how to just do the work. They also taught me to, honestly, a lot of what I do is, I call it echolalia. I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but because I'm not formally trained as a writer, I often rely just on how things sound. I write by ear like certain musicians play by ear. And there are pros and cons to that. This is not about which way is better. This is just about how I got here and how I stay here. But writing by ear is mostly how I work. So if I'm writing a newspaper column, I have this voice where I realize I have a very short period of time to get the story across. And I'm a guy who will go on and off on tangents forever. And I think one of the great lessons I learned in the very first 6 months of writing a column was I used to lay them all out and I try to hit 8 points in 600 words. Well, you can't do that. And I've learned now that a newspaper column usually begins with one tiny, tiny little idea. The one for this week was our stock pan on the oven, boiling down the very last batch of tomatoes. And I knew that just from that one little scene, I'm going to have plenty. And I don't need to go far afield, and I don't need to revisit all of nature or tell people how to grow tomatoes. I just need to focus on that one end result. And in this particular instance, I remembered the day we planted the tomatoes. And so I can't even remember what the original question was, which is kind of why I'm in this business, just going off on tangents. But I think being forced to adjust my voice, sometimes I chafe at it. If there's times I want to really become, do more exposition, or I want to get very poetic. But there's times when you have to constrain that to fit the format you're working within. And it's okay in the end, because I talk about the newspaper column. I put my heart into that column every week, and I try to put humor in it when it's appropriate. But I also say that a newspaper column is like a form of writing calisthenics, because you just got to do it. And you can't dwell on it. You can't wait for the right moment. You have to finish it and turn it in. So again, I've pretty much forgotten what the original question was.
It was just kind of about the different styles of writing, but I think you sort of struck on
Oh,
something
yeah.
that might resonate with, there's lots of people out there who would like to write, or they write, but they don't know what to do with it, or, and the idea that you just have to keep writing and get it done. I think, and also that a small idea can be a really big story, can be a really great story, and they don't have to be long.
Yeah, I
I
think
feel like people stumble, I have to write 10,000 words, and
the other thing, ultimately voice, which is what we're talking about here. Voice, for years I said that achieving your own voice was more a passive than an active process. And I still think that's true. The older I've gotten, the less willing I am to speak in declaratives. Aphorism. Like I used to be you have to write every day guy. I really believe that. And I've come, thanks to another writer who completely called me on that. And I don't think that that's true for everybody. And it turns out it's not always even true for me. So I don't know if I'm right when I say that achieving your own distinctive voice is a passive process. But what I mean by that, which I think is still applicable, is I read and read voraciously. I read many different styles. I read poetry. I read nonfiction. I read essays. I read fiction. I even read things like speculative fiction and science fiction that really aren't my thing. That's not a negative comment. They're just not in my wheelhouse, either as a writer or as a reader. But I do that because I want those different voices in my head so that I have something to react to. And I think and then the other big impediment, I just had this discussion with 2 people this week. A lot of people are writing right now. I can tell because I get manuscripts and essays sent to me on a daily basis, and people want me to read them and critique them. And I'm like, dude, I can't even get my own work done. But I absolutely understand the impulse. And what I tell those folks with all my heart is, so many of them are like, oh, I have the idea, you should write it because you're right. I'm like, no, you have the idea. You also have the words. Just blurt it out, whether you scribble it down, whether you talk into your phone or a tape recorder, if that's your era, whatever it is, get the mess down. The fun part is sorting through the mess, and anybody can do it. And so I think, we try to, even I just worked on a section in a book this morning. I wasted an hour trying to get the introduction to this paragraph just how I liked it. And then I just went back 25 years and said, what have you been learning for 25 years? And I wrote a page of really cruddy stuff, out of which there will be 3 lines that will be absolutely essential to the finished piece. So
I think a lot of your fans would, sorry, I think a lot of your fans would find it interesting that you just said, I wrote a page of cruddy stuff.
Oh, writing is one of the hardest things I do. I'm not naturally equipped. I am not one of these people that I can't see plot. I work very piecemeal. I have to cut things apart physically on paper and paste them together to get them to make sense. And I also write horrible first drafts, of course. And no, I always say that for me, writing is like carving concrete with a spoon. It's an abysmally slow process for me. I get through it because I like, my favorite thing in the whole wide world is revision. And that's my reward, is if I do all the really bad, ugly, heavy lifting writing, then someday I get to start revising. And that's just fun, because that just takes me back when I had hair and sat in a coffee shop all day, perfecting my really pretty awful poetry.
Now, is it as much fun when an editor that you have polishes and fine tunes something that you've worked on? Because that happens in the book industry a lot.
I love having editors because, again, now I'll give you one qualification at the end. And if I go off on a tangent and forget, remind me, I'm going to
Okay.
give you a qualification. I love being edited. I get so many emails where people view that process as adversarial. And they're like, how do you protect your stuff from editors? And I go, man, I want editors because, again, I'm an outsider. I have a little bit of, this gets overused and I'm going to overuse it now, but I have imposter syndrome all the time. I'm not trained to do this. I don't come with the academic background. And I always rush to point out, I admire the academic background. People sometimes expect me to be dismissive of MFA programs or that sort of thing. I think there are issues with how they're applied and how they're sold, but I admire people who understand writing to the great depth that someone who's trained in that area is. I love people who can talk about plot devices and parallel structure and things that I try to do intuitively, but I don't have the language to express. So when I get an editor, I mean, you're talking to a guy who I can't, and I'm not joking here, I look it up all the time, who and whom. I have a terrible time sorting that kind of stuff out. I love when an editor gives me feedback because we're all so hungry for feedback and constructive feedback. The other thing that has affected me from ever since my college days, when I got my first real feedback on writing in a creative writing course, is that unlike someone who approached the table with my precious art, I didn't know any better. So I just said, oh, here's what I wrote. I think it's pretty good. And someone said, no, it can be better. And what surprised me about that was it didn't hurt my feelings. It sent me right back to my knuckleheaded football playing days. And what I loved about football was the coach would say, hit him harder. And I would just go, okay, I will. And I wasn't a violent kid, but I loved the violence within those parameters where there were rules and there were, acceptable ways to deliver that violence. And I also liked that football was a sport that even if you're down 20 in the fourth quarter, there is still a chance that if you just buckle down and work harder, you'll get better, you might win. And so when editors comment on my pieces, even if they're difficult comments, I always feel like it's the football coach pushing me to do better, not criticizing me, not cutting me down, but really saying, hey, I can help you. And if you accept my help, you'll get better. And I feel that way to this day. Now, the only qualification I have is that after many years of writing, I really am not precious about my stuff. Even this, I helped with this corporate letter I mentioned earlier in the interview. When I sent it back to the folks who asked me to help, I said, just say whatever you want about it. You can't hurt me. People have been talking about my writing in public for 30 years now. And so I do have that, but I've also written long enough and I know myself and a little bit of my audience well enough to know there are times when I just say, no, I disagree. And it's not because I'm being petulant. It's not because I'm being precious. I don't feel protective. But in this case, I just say, no, I thank you for your input. I disagree. Stet, which in the publishing business, means take your change and don't change it.
Right.
But it's pretty rare, but it's usually for good reason. There's the story I always bring up is I wrote a book called Population 485. And in the opening paragraph, there is a line in there that my most trusted editor at the time, the person who I simply wouldn't be having this conversation with you if it wasn't for this person and the things that person taught me. That person had a real problem with one of the lines in the opening chapter of in the opening paragraph of Population 485. Over and over, he told me to cut that line. And I just kept listening to it and I go, no, it's what I mean. It's part of the poetry. It's the deal. And I kept that line. And to this day, I mean, gosh, what are we, 18 years out from that book being published? I still get emails and comments from people saying how much they love that line without any encouragement from me. So there's a case where my most trusted mentor gave me advice and I chose to ignore it. But it was the context within which I chose to ignore it that makes the distinction.
Well, and you touched on this a little bit earlier. You mentioned that a lot of people, or a lot more people, it seems, are writing right now, almost as a therapy in a way, it's something to do, but also some way to express what they're feeling. Um, the Wisconsin Historical Society actually has a COVID journaling project that it started to help record some of the history of this. And I don't know if you journal specifically, but can you talk to the folks at home that are just trying to write down their thoughts, whether it's about COVID or just about their lives? Some tips maybe for how to go about that and how to keep doing it. Doing it every day is sometimes challenging.
Yeah, and I would say I'd go back to my write every day credo. I don't believe that anymore. And so for gosh sakes, don't put some sort of silly, undue, unnecessary pressure on yourself. I have a daughter right now who's doing NaNoWriMo. And if you want to do that and you enter into it freely, go for it. I think it's a great tool where you write every day and you try to hit a certain amount of words every day. I think that's great practice. But again, don't impose something on yourself that's not natural or not productive. I don't journal. I have off and on over the years, but it always just made me melancholy when I went back and wrote and read it, what I had written. I take a lot of notes, I make a lot of observations, but I don't formally journal. I think the number one thing I would say, and we've already kind of touched on it, is just spill it out. Don't take the filters off. Don't think about somebody critiquing it or editing it. And there's two reasons that I can say that and mean it with all my heart. One of them is selfish. As a guy who has written a lot of nonfiction and who has gone back and dug through old ledgers, notes, scraps, magazines, sometimes journals, you'd be surprised at the fragments that are powerful. It isn't the big, long, flowery journal entry that you're moved by. It's the little, like I would go back when I was writing about my hometown and I got some ledgers, literal ledgers written out, big honking old hardcover bound books. And to read, what somebody paid for a tin pail in 1912. Or to read what they paid for some chicken feed, and then to realize, to then see that name also and know that name was still in the community, and to think about those threads. Those things are powerful and evocative. Nobody wrote that down thinking, I must express myself. They were just keeping track of stuff.
Right.
Or finding little scraps of paper where people, something happened one day and it's tucked inside a book. And a person 100 years ago made note of it, tucked it in as a bookmark and forgot about it. I'm far more interested in that scrap of paper than I am the book. So that's the first thing. Selfishly, I love when people leave unfinished, imperfect notations on the past. The second thing, and this has happened to me more times now than for a long time, I told this story about something that happened to me once. It has now happened to me several times. I've been approached at live events and someone will say, my uncle, my husband, my grandma, whoever it is, has an amazing story to tell, but they're not a writer. And we just start trying to decide, how do we start and what should we do and how do we get a book published? And time again, I just say what I've already said in this interview, just have that person get it down, whether they write it in longhand on a legal pad with bad spelling and poor grammar, whether you just record them on your phone, just get it down, because that material will be gold to you one day. And I've now had more than once, but I'll tell that the first time that I knew I'd given the right advice was I was back in an area where I'd performed before. I was signing books after the fact. And a woman came up, I didn't recognize her, with her daughter. And she said, you don't remember us, but we were here a year ago. And my husband I asked you how my husband could go about writing his memoirs because he wasn't a writer. And you told us to just have him get it down. And he did that. And then he died unexpectedly. And she said, I cannot tell you how much those words that he wrote down mean to us now. And so that, I think, is the thing I really would encourage people to think about. Books, publication, revision, formalizing your writing, that can all be done down the road. And I hope if that's what you want to do, you do. But that's so secondary to the importance of just getting the material committed to some lasting form or format. I don't know, whatever. And the last thing I would say is, it's never been easier to self-publish. And that's how I got started. I self-published my first 4 books, but it was arduous, and I had to find a printer, and I had to find someone who knew how to do book layout, and I just had to buy 1,000 copies of my book and put them in my garage. Well, nowadays with whether it's print on demand or different services, as long as make sure you're not being taken advantage of. There's a lot of shysters out there, but I'm self-publishing some things right now. There are certain projects, I've published with some big New York publishers. I've had a terrific relationship with Wisconsin Historical Society Press. One of the things I tell people about WHSP that I love is they're regional, they're my people, but they're also nimble and they're responsive. Whereas the big publishers, they are driven by big numbers. And a guy like me, I do well enough, but I can tell you they aren't convening special sessions to figure out how to manage my career. But I also, sometimes you have projects, and I've had a couple where they just don't quite fit with a publisher. And in my case, I've just gone ahead and self-published those books. And the process really has become quite streamlined. And so there's no question, I'm not going to deny it. There's a certain cachet associated with having a New York publisher. And it's kind of like where this interview started, talking about the New York Times bestseller list. I'd be silly if I sat here and said, oh, it don't mean nothing. No, it does mean something. But there's a lot of false status or empty status assigned to these things. I have self-published books that have far outsold books that were published by established presses. So that's my last thing, is to say, don't shy away from, and people also go, well, but what if I self-publish and then I don't get a book deal because I already self-published? I'm like, if your self-published book is selling enough copies that the big publishers are sniffing around, you'll be fine.
That's right. Well, and I had another question too, just kind of about the book business, because writing is just a part of what you do as an author. And the other parts that you do as an author have changed a lot since COVID hit, I would imagine. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that. I think a lot of writers don't understand that the writing is just a part of the work. There's speaking and traveling and all kinds of things.
Promotion, some folks don't like to talk about promotion or marketing or the business side of it. I don't mind, because it's just part of the deal. Unless you have a massive following, or unless you have a means of income other than writing, or unless you really don't care, and I don't mean this even in a negative sense, but if sales numbers aren't important to you, then marketing and the business side of it isn't a big deal. But in my case, I'm self-employed, just like I always use my poor brother, the logger. I think he's probably sick of me drawing equivalencies between our chosen professions, but I'm just as self-employed as he is. He's got a bunch of logs down, and the big company that buys them just went bankrupt. So he's got to hustle and figure out a way to sell those logs. Well, I write books for a living. I don't think it's any secret, even in present company, that the book publishing industry and book selling is really under incredible duress right now. And so I can either fret about that, or I can do everything I can on my end to help everybody on the team starting with me and my family, but also, how can I help my publishers help me? How can I get the word out about my books? And some of it's so basic, like 25 years ago when I did readings and only 2 people came, I usually got at least one of them got their name written down on, back in those days, a recipe card with their address. And then they got a postcard when I had a book out. Now, I'm using MailChimp and a big email address list that I've compiled over the years. And a lot of those names come from people signing up for my list when they're at live events or at my website. The website is a marketing tool. Setting up my own little web store, and always balancing what I'm doing with paying attention to the people who've really helped me. Publishers like Wisconsin Historical Society Press, independent booksellers who hand sold me into existence. You have to pay attention to all of these things. And then for me, a big part of, as I've said a couple of times, I don't have a massive audience. I can't just sit back and collect royalties. And just because I write a book doesn't mean it's going to make enough money that I can take the rest of the year off. Far from it. But I have learned that if I pay attention to my audience, if I get out there and hustle, and in my case, that means getting out on the road, doing live events, I can make a living. Well, that all disappeared last March, went to zero. And, that affected I would say roughly half our income went away in a heartbeat. Now, compared to what a lot of folks are going through, that's another privilege to only lose half of your income. But I've just had to double down on, some self-publishing projects, marketing, posting, taking care of social media, sending out emails, trying to find that balance where you don't drive people nuts, but you also remind them that, we do have books available. Linking through to publishers, linking through to Wisconsin Historical Society Press, just trying to keep that whole little ecosystem going. And again, the only thing I don't like about marketing and promotion is, my favorite thing in the world is to just sit at my desk and write. But the thing I always tell people who have reservations about it is, again, unless you have that outside source of income, or you're set, or you don't have to worry about it, all of that so-called crass marketing and promotion, that's just financing writing time. And the fact that I will spend, even though I'm going to do a couple interviews today, and I did work on a promotional email this morning, the bulk of my day will be spent working on a book, and that time is financed by the hustle. So anyway, I always feel like I'm putting my foot in my mouth and I'm not addressing everything, and that I'm being dismissive of something and unintentionally. I don't mean to be at all. I'm just trying to speak really frankly about making a living as a writer when you're not the million seller. And then this is the part of the talk where I also always say, please, please, please hear me say this. Write first and foremost for the love of it. Don't miss the part of the talk today where I say the first thing I want to do in the morning is write. So don't put pressure on yourself. We already talked about don't put pressure on yourself to write the perfect thing. Also, don't put pressure on yourself to use sales numbers as validation. There's tons of reasons that amazing, powerful, essential, necessary books only sell 100 copies. It's got nothing to do with the quality of your writing or you as an artist.
Absolutely. We have different kinds with the Historical Society Press, we have all different kinds of authors, writers, different topics, different styles. One thing that the 3 books of yours that we published, From the Top, Roughneck Grace, Danger Man Working, are all collections of some of the shorter things you write, which is sort of a unique style of book, really. And one is based on your State Journal columns, Roughneck Grace, magazine articles, and your monologues, which is a whole another kind of writing. All frank, all entertaining, some of them humorous, some of them very powerfully emotional. One of the ones that you share is I'll call it an essay, that you might not say it's an essay, but on gratitude. And as this Q&A is going to be posted just before Thanksgiving, we're going to run that gratitude piece excerpt alongside with this watch party. And I don't know if you can speak to maybe the backside of that story. What inspired you to write that specific piece, if you recall? Or I guess, what does it mean to you today, if anything different than when you wrote it?
I do remember when I wrote it. First, let me just say, I've never gone viral with anything. That's the closest I've come. I've probably received more feedback on that piece. And by the way, it is, if I'm not mistaken, it is the final piece in the Wisconsin Historical Society Press collection called Roughneck Grace. Yesterday, I got an email from a woman in California who said, I just came across this. Our book club was asked to look for pieces on gratitude, and I found yours. And now I'm buying that book and buying a couple of your other books because of that piece. You know, it's at least 4 years since I wrote that piece. And so, and I read it on public radio one time, and the feedback immediately was unexpected. And I think lately when I've talked to people about that piece, the point I've tried to make is that I was struggling to feel gratitude when I wrote that piece, which is part of the reason I wrote it. It was written at a time of pretty significant historical significance. Did I just say significant oral? Significant historical significance. See, that's what editing is for. But it was written at a time when I was not feeling my best about the country, and also, reservations about myself. A lot of my writing is about how I fall short to the guy looking at me in the mirror every morning. That's my biggest challenge right there. And so that piece was actually driven by a struggle to find gratitude. And I've been trying to talk about that if I've learned anything in these my 50s, it's how to express and acknowledge gratitude, even when I'm not feeling that good about things, because I still need to step back. And, the silly New York Times bestseller thing we talked about is part of that I can, on one hand, acknowledge that was not my best-selling book, but I can also say it's something I'm so grateful for. So I think the power of that piece is that I think people are exploring the idea of gratitude, especially in a time when gratitude can be a struggle. And if it connects with people the way they say it does, I'm just grateful. That does come back to I was raised by roughnecks. I'm pretty much a stoic roughneck, but thank goodness for poetry and writing. I found a way. I often say I look like a logger, but I feel like a poet, and that leads to problems sometimes. But one of my gratitudes is that I do have writing. I don't view writing as strictly therapeutic, but sometimes it is nothing but therapeutic. And how there's a form of gratitude for me that I can, when I'm struggling with gratitude, write an essay about it. And it turns out that it strikes a chord with a range of readers and listeners I never anticipated. And so I'm so happy that it's in that book, in Roughneck Grace. And so happy that people still buy the book, and then I get emails saying, hey, I read this essay. And so I'm glad speaking of editors, I worked with editors there to decide what pieces should go in and how they should be ordered. And it was an editorial decision to place that piece as it is. So grateful for that.
Well, let's hope that once again, your writing brings a little thought of gratitude to people right now. As I said, as we share that piece here at the end of the video, and we're very grateful that you're one of our authors, and thankful to be bringing the pieces of history and culture that you share through your writing with Wisconsin and beyond. And I'm just thankful that you were able to join us for a little chat today. And everyone, you can find out more about Michael Perry, his website, sneezingcow.com, or at our website, wisconsinhistory.org/WHS Press. So everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving and holiday season. And once again, thank you all very much.